Tell me about your family life, what life was like in Youngstown growing up.
Actually, one of my earliest childhood memories was of hiding a gun because my stepfather was an abusive alcoholic. And when he drank, he got more abusive, both to my mother and to my brother and myself. When we moved to Fayetteville, actually Spring Lake was the city, and and then shortly thereafter, I found out that I was pregnant. So I quit school when I was 15. And then my daughter was born when I was 16. And she lived for about 4 months and then died of acute bronchial pneumonia.
You right there?
Yeah.
Okay.
You'll say Terry, take one.
Are we ready?
Be ready.
Okay. Terry, take one.
I was born in the city of Ramallah, 7 miles north of Jerusalem. My life was wonderful till age 10. Israel invaded the rest of Palestine, and we became under occupation. And my life.
What does that mean?
That's mean hell. If just simply with one sentence, hell. Your life stopped being your life. Somebody somebody took charge of what you do, when you do it, how you do it. Even inside your homes, you could be sleeping at 2 o'clock in the morning and soldiers will come into your house, take your dad, put him on the wall, and you're standing there screaming because you thought they're going to shoot him. And they just search the house and leave.
1975, June 7th. I was in kindergarten and I saw a shadow of a man walk across our front yard or front lawn in front of the windows to our front door and knocked on the door. Just so happened that this guy was stalking my mother. He shot through the door and the bullet struck my mother in the chest. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I was, screaming, and she was present. And she told me that she loved me. And, I was saying, I love you too, Mommy. I love you too. And my mother bled out there and passed away before the ambulance could get there.
The goal is to summit, and the summit is like 19,341 feet. I feel as though I've been climbing mountains all of my life.
Kilimanjaro is the same thing. Everybody thinks it's so high, it's so mighty, it's so big, it's unattainable, you cannot do it. Take a special person. It does not.
My dream for the documentary is that women around the world will see it. To see the trauma that Terry, Tammy, and I have experienced, to maybe reflect on whatever happened in their lives and what they made it mean. Because each one of us made it mean something. And there's a role I need to play. I want women to claim their place in making a change in the system. So Terry, Tammy, and I had the pleasure of climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, excuse me, in September. September 13th was the actual day that we summited. And the three of us believe in the power of personal narrative for building trust and connection, as well as social transformation. And that's exactly what the Three Extraordinary Women documentary is intended to do. It's actually a social impact film that tells our three stories as three women who have overcome childhood trauma, yet went on to build successful lives and to become advocates for social justice. You might have heard me say in one of my moments of reflection that I feel like I've been climbing mountains all of my life, because that's my truth. We reached the summit of Kilimanjaro on September 13th. And if you advance the slide, it was about 37 miles. So I'm going to give you just a brief background and information about the actual climb itself. And then I'm going to tell you a bit more about my story and what this means for me. And then Terry and Tammy are going to do the same. So just logistically, we went up over the course of 6 days. We summited on the 6th day. Each one of us made it. And so it's compelling for me because of this metaphor of overcoming life circumstances and challenges. And I think Terry and Tammy will say a bit about that themselves, but also because we're women of color and we're quote unquote middle-aged. Terry is 64 and she was the eldest of us. And Tammy and I are both 52. And so it was, I think, one of the most challenging things each of us has done. And it was also one of the most extraordinary because it was 37 miles or so round trip. We went up the Machame route, which is incredibly beautiful. And as the highest freestanding mountain in the world and the top of Tanzania, the peak, they call it Uhuru, which basically means freedom in Swahili. And they affectionately, when I say they, I mean the Tanzanians, refer to it as the top of Africa. And so going to the place of freedom, metaphorically, like how do we achieve freedom in the world as a representation of also achieving in personal freedom? How do I free myself? How do I free my mind from, and then ultimately, how do I free these systems of oppression that exist in the world is really the combination of this documentary. So I want to just set the stage a bit for how climbing Kilimanjaro is really about gender and racial equity and well-being, because the goal and the impact of this film is intended to do just that. It is to help wake up people to the truth that many of us are experience traumatic experiences, oftentimes in childhood. There's quite a bit of research that talks about the relationship between childhood trauma and substance abuse and mental health challenges and like depression. If we could advance to the next slide. So there's something really compelling about the power of storytelling for the purpose of uniting, because basically there's one story, there's a human story. And so much of us have experienced trauma and then we don't talk about it. And there's quite a bit of shame. I know for myself, I, having grown up in poverty, in public housing, and in a domestic violence household, I got pregnant when I was 15. I dropped out of high school. I had my daughter that you see, and then she died when I was 16. I was a baby myself. I didn't even know the word trauma. I didn't know that what I had experienced was trauma, frankly. And I certainly didn't talk about it. I felt ashamed, like something was wrong with me. And it took me many years to figure out, really, there's nothing wrong with me. These systems, in part, are intended to keep people in the cycle of poverty, in the cycles, the various cycles that exist. And so my first mountains, metaphorically, were emotional and mental, having witnessed and experienced the things that I experienced. And I think Terry and Tammy will speak of something similar. However, we each made it mean something. There was some post-traumatic growth that we experienced, having learned from those things that happened to us, and how we internalized it was actually, there's nothing wrong with me. There's something wrong with these systems. And I want to be a part of changing the systems that disproportionately impact women and their children, which basically means the world and everyone in it, but also people of color in particular. And so instead of being ashamed of my past and not communicating about it and the mental health challenges that existed within my family, I personally coped by dissociating, shutting down from my emotions. I became a highly driven person, went on to graduate from and be the first person in my family to go to college, but also to law school, have a PhD in psychology. My desire in telling my personal story is really to bring awareness to um, not just me, obviously, but to the circumstances that are so common, and to help us to get rid of the shame. You know, we're not necessarily responsible for the things that happen to us, and our empowerment lies in what we make it mean, and then how we transform that into changing the narrative, which is the next topic and the next slide. And I have the pleasure of introducing you to Tammy Johnston, who I met in ninth grade in our choir class in Youngstown, Ohio. And a part of what's very powerful for her, as she talks about changing the narrative, is what's compelling for her in telling her story and climbing Kilimanjaro and social justice.
Thank you, Pearlette. I am Tammy Johnston, and I actually want to ask a quick question, a logistical question, before we continue. Lena, I see that there's only 5 participants here, which is us, Pearlette, Terry, myself, and you two. And so I just wanted to make sure. I know that we had to get like separate Zoom links in order to get into this. Do you think people who want to participate or wanted to attend this forum were able to get in? Okay, got it. Thank you. So yes, changing the narrative. So, you know, as Pearlette mentioned, Kilimanjaro was not my only mountain to climb. I too had many Kilimanjaros in my life leading up to this one. But the purpose around climbing Kilimanjaro for me, and as you can see here, this is at the top, this is at Uhuru, this image here, and I'm showing a t-shirt that says, "I am my ancestors." And so, you know, my focus, my social justice focus is really around changing the narrative around people of color and across the diaspora. So if you could, Lena, if you could go to the next piece of the slide, I have some moving parts in here. The way to change this, you know, there's, if you could click a couple of times, there are a few different ways, you know, in which we can change the narrative about people of color across the diaspora, but specifically here in the United States. I wanted to give an example. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Lovecraft Country that premiered on HBO maybe about a year ago. The creator of the show on HBO, who was this woman here, she wrote and produced Lovecraft Country as it premiered on HBO. But when she went to create the second season, her name is Misha Green. And when she went to create the second season, you know, she wrote the concept of the second season. And if you know anything about Lovecraft Country, you know, it's really about the Black experience, the African American experience in the United States during Jim Crow. When she went to create the second season and pitch the second season to HBO, what she had really done was create a story from the African American perspective of what America would have been like if Jim Crow had been erased and white supremacy had been defeated. And HBO declined to renew the second season. What this drives home is that we have to tell our own stories. And our stories, you know, you say, well, you know, we've got a lot of, you know, Black artists right now, or African American artists right now, who are writing and producing stories that are being shown on streaming services or on, TV or on the big screen. But the question really is, if it promotes imperialism and normalizes whiteness, it's really not telling our story. And if you could click again a couple of times. The social structure versus the governance structure. So changing the narrative also includes not just telling our story, right? So you've got 3 women of color who climbed Kilimanjaro. We are not the only women of color who have done this and have achieved this, but you wouldn't know that if you only get your information, from TV or streaming services, entertainment. But, the questions that we should be asking ourselves, African Americans as well as, European Americans, is who are we to society versus who we are to each other? So there's a social structure at play here, and there's also a governance structure at play here. And those 2 questions should really be approached when we're looking to tell stories of ourselves, we're looking to tell our stories. And the other piece of this is that we have to control our narrative. When you control your narrative and you tell your story from the perspective of the social structure versus the governance structure, you begin to change your mind about our place in the world and how we see ourselves in the world. And other people start to change their minds about how we show up and who we are to the world. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So what I wanted to do here was really show you what's being done. So this liberation work is already in play, and there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel, right? Because these things are already happening. From a social media perspective, we've got several organizations or several tools here that have been created that are African American based and that look at the world from the Black perspective, or from the people of color perspective, from the diaspora perspective. It's built that way. It's built to educate. It's built to really look at history from a truthful perspective that brings us into today. And really technology is the great equalizer. So all of these things are possible because of technology, because of the internet, because African Americans know how to code. We should be utilizing this. There is a forum in Africa, the largest Africana study class in the world is on YouTube, and that is In Class with Dr. Carr. Issa Rae has created her own streaming service and her own content. And it's based on her, so she's the person who greenlights it. She's the person making the decisions. She doesn't have to get approval from, CBS, ABC, Paramount, or whatever parent company that normally greenlights content that is being shown. She's created her own. And so the idea here is that we could and should be utilizing these things and or creating our own to tell our own story, and not look to CBS or the Discovery Channel, to say, hey, if you guys don't pick up my content, then I can't put it out. And the other key that I think is important in changing the narrative is collaboration. When you think about people of color, we are the global majority. And that's the other piece of changing the narrative, is changing our conversation and changing how we talk about ourselves. We are the global majority. And so collaboration is key. We're stronger together. And as a result, reaching across the diaspora or utilizing tools that may be created already, or creating our own tools to get our message out, to get our stories out. That helps in liberating ourselves from the white supremacist system that we've been born into.
I think right now would be a great time for us to log our poll. We do have a poll question if we could. So the intent of the question is to gain some insight on what your personal experiences have been. I know what the research says because I am a researcher, and I mentioned earlier that many of us have experienced trauma. About 80%, 75 to 80% is what the research says. And so often we diminish our own stories, right? Our own personal experiences. And yet that's the very thing that unites us all. At the heart of it, poor people, it's important that we live, I say poor people, the vast majority of the continent or of the world, people are impoverished, frankly. And there's such a bigger gap now than it had been, and it's continuing to grow between the ultra rich and the rest of us. And so as Tammy talked about the diaspora, a part of what was really powerful for us in experiencing the culture within Tanzania is the conversations are the same. The experiences that we have in the US are very similar to the experiences that are had in Africa, that are similar to the experiences that people have in Australia and across Europe. When we talk about the disproportionate impact of the effects of colonialism and the whitewashing, really, of the narrative. And so as we're waiting for the results to come back, I want to queue up just a piece of the conversation that Terry is going to talk about, because she was actually born in Ramallah. However, because of a number of circumstances, was brought to the United States of America. And although she is very much an advocate for the Palestinian people, what she's going to speak to is the challenges that the Palestinian people face, or the challenges that every disenfranchised community around the world faces. And so there are similarities, and the power is in our uniting, which is at the heart of what this documentary is intended to do. So looks like more than one of the above, 50-50, all of the above. Okay, wow. So that's quite significant. It looks like all of the above, 50% of you said yes to all of the above, and then more than one, 50%. So that's quite significant. So if we could go to the next slide, and just in introducing Terry, who I met 20 years ago. We were working together, and actually one of our first experiences was going to a march in DC against the war on terror. Is how we got to know one another, and have not just traveled the world, but done so in a way to contribute our time and efforts for social justice issues around the globe. So Terry Awal, if you would take the mic.
Thank you, Pearlette. I'll be talking about the Palestinian community and my Kilimanjaro experience. In 1948, the United Nations had a declaration, Human Rights Declaration, which states all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The same year, a Palestinian, including my mother and her father, her family, were evicted from her home by the British Empire to make room for immigrants from Europe. And in 1967, I experienced what my mother and her family experienced when the early occupation hometown and we became oppressed. At age 10, I became aware of what is injustice and justice in climbing Kilimanjaro and worse than Kilimanjaro every day of my life. Climbing Kilimanjaro gave me a lot of perspective. One of the biggest perspective that I had climbing, and it's a hard climb. Every day I thought of my grandmother, I thought of my parents, I thought of my mother as a refugee. As we're climbing up, I'm thinking this is a trip that we booked, we wanted to do, and it's wonderful. And we want to bring attention to other people that if you make up your mind, you'll be able to do this. But I kept thinking, my mother and her family did not have a choice. They were walking from town to town aimlessly. They don't even know where they were going because they were evicted from their homeland. And this trend has continued and continued till today, actually. And so therefore, climbing the obstacles that people in power put in place is a daily thing, not only for the Palestinian people, for all kinds of minorities and brown people. I mean, I reflect back on what the slaves went through. I reflect back on what the people that lived under the Jim Crow have survived and persevered. You know, it's funny, we sometimes concentrate on the obstacles and the problems that are put in our way, but rarely do we reflect on the resolute and the work of what people have achieved despite all the obstacles. Going back to Pearlette and Tammy and myself, we grew up not in an ideal situation, but each one of us climbed and persevered and were able to achieve and continue to achieve. In fact, if you ask any of us today, we will say, oh, we're still reaching out, we're still doing things, our goal is, and our dream is. As we climbed Kilimanjaro, I was able to talk to some of the porters that were working with me, and the guides and the assistant guides that were working with me. First of all, the first thing that you notice is what hardworking people they are. They are amazingly, resolute in how hard they work. So the other question you say, as you go on, you ask, what are your dreams and what are your goals? And each one of them have goals beyond what they're doing. The job that they're doing, even though it's a good job for them in their community, but they want to be something else. For instance, the guide wanted to be a doctor. The porter wanted to be a guide. So we all have, as human beings, the capability of dreaming. But dreaming is not enough. Dreaming and working together as a group, I think we could achieve and overcome a lot of obstacles. Before I went to Kilimanjaro, I had a Zoom call with some of my friends from my childhood, and I told them that I'm climbing Kilimanjaro. And two things they said to me: A, you're a woman and you're climbing, that should be a man's job, which really offended me, but I think, it tells you that some people still think that way. The second thing people say, it's your age, you're 64, almost 65. Are you crazy? Why would you be climbing? And so therefore, somebody have taught us to put limitation on ourselves. And really, we cannot continue to do that. So me teaming up with Pearlette, which I adore, and not for many reasons, but she keeps dreaming and she keeps doing, and same I find out with Tammy and others. So together, just imagine if we all together, we keep dreaming and doing, and what changes we will make, each in our own way. Some want to overturn the system. Some want to work within the system. Some want to basically do small stuff. Some want to do big stuff. What I advise people from our community, from the Palestinian community, we can't all do it alone, but if we all take a small segment at a time, just take a commitment, one day at a time, we will achieve. And I really believe in that. So I do want to thank you for inviting us to speak. And I hope that we could be an example for others to emulate, because we are all capable, and we are together, we definitely could overcome. And so I really have hope. Thank you.
We could go to the next slide. I want to say a bit about nature, and I'm sorry, about women and equality and courageous leadership, and then a bit about nature. So I have this quote here that is my quote, actually, because a part of what is very much I'm passionate about, and one of the central focuses of this documentary is really around the empowerment of women. One of the primary goals is empowering, inspiring, encouraging women and girls to open their hearts and minds to acknowledge their power and resilience, and to express that through courageous leadership. And there's a specific thing when I say courageous leadership, what I mean not the model of leadership that's espoused, which is, to deny a part of your humanity. You got to act a certain way. You got to check your personality at the door. Not that, but really listening and responding to our calling. Because I think there's a calling on each one of us, and allowing our intuition, that sixth sense that's a part of who each one of us is, to help guide us in awakening to whatever our truth is, and then being that in the world. And a part of that is sharing our stories, because it helps to unite us in humanity. And so this idea of, and I think women, I hate to put the responsibility of changing the world on the backs of women. I've been a feminist most of my life. And at the same time, I do believe that if the world is going to change, it's going to be when women decide, okay, I'm done. And in the work that I do with women in leadership, so often claiming our power and our voice is a challenge, because of, we don't think we're enough, or we don't have this experience, and oh, my story is not, I'm not, or it's not. And that's a part of the, I think, indoctrination of worthiness, right? I'm not enough for whatever reason. This happened to me. I'm not at this next level. So there's always the next, that maybe at some future point I will be able to, and that's not true. The reality is we're all enough right now. We're needed, like we were needed yesterday. We're needed right now. And anything that keeps us from stepping into our truth, our light, claiming our power, our story, to make the difference, to advance the cause, to make the world a better place, because we're all around the world in the same struggle separately, we need to move out of the way. And so courageous leadership is just heart-centered leadership, and owning and acknowledging our truth, our power, our light, to make the unique difference that we're called to make. And I personally feel called to be in that conversation for women, with women, because I believe women are going to save the world. That's a part of my dream. And so if we could go to the next slide, part of what's really important for me that's central to that is nature and well-being. There's a theme that has run through Terry and Tammy in my life, and it's been traveling. I believe in the transformative power of travel in so many different ways. It requires that you stretch, yourself, particularly if you travel alone. And that's one of the ways in which I have stretched myself. But one of the things that it's done has been to connect me with nature and a sense of myself in a way that growing up in Youngstown in Ohio, in the hood, living in public housing, I can't even tell you. I had no sense of connection to nature. So what you see on the slide are actually photos from the journey up Kilimanjaro. There's several different ecosystems. There's this whole thing about, environmental justice, but so many times people of color, Black folks in particular, don't feel safe, like in national parks. Certainly, there's a joke that some of my hiking friends and I will say to each other, like, Black people don't hike. That's the narrative. We don't do those types of things. Well, who says that? And the reality is, this planet is also being attacked. And many of us are experiencing so much stress. I'm just going to mention a little bit about the research, because we exist in this culture of high stress. Like when I say high stress, I mean mental tension. We're worried, we're anxious. There's internal pressure to perform, to be successful. And for 2 years, the American Psychological Association, or APA, excuse me, commissioned an annual stress survey, which found that 25% of Americans experience high stress, like on like fill in the gun all the time, while another 50% reported a moderate level of stress, which means, you may not feel the gun all the time, but you're consistently running. Well, there's a couple problems with that. First of all, that's 75% of people who have a constant sense of stress. And for those who are people of color, and I'll speak, as a African American Latina woman, it's normal, and it's a part of what contributes to our having comorbidities, because we're often so stressed because it's at an all-time high. Many of us who are women are managing not just our lives, we're managing things in the community, we're managing and assisting our family members and others, and we don't necessarily take care of ourselves. So when we feel stress, we are biologically programmed to be less creative, less compassionate, less visionary, and frankly, we're too tired to become involved in social political activity. When we get home at the end of the day and we finish taking care of all of our responsibilities, we don't necessarily want to go out and change the world. We just want to sit down. And that also, I think, is a part of, the great masquerade of the system, right? Keep us so preoccupied that, we don't feel compelled to, because we're preoccupied in the stress of just making it, or in the stress of becoming successful. And so this idea of connection with nature and our own well-being, prioritizing myself, is incredibly important. Nature is one of the best equalizers. I think if Terry and Tammy spoke about nature, they'd say one of the things we talked about when we were there is just taking in the beauty of it. It helped us to feel more connected to ourselves, first of all, and then to nature. So if we could go to the next slide, the vision of the documentary is to make a social impact. And I think I may have said a little earlier that there's a couple different themes that flow through the documentary, but making a social impact is the primary one. And resilience is a part of this process that we've each used, Terry, Tammy, and I, either consciously or unconsciously, to make meaning of the things that happen in our lives. And because we're so stressed most often, we're not really focusing on our own internal experience and how those stressors impact us. And so telling our stories, being really candid and honest and open about the trauma and what we made it mean and how that happened and how we were able to take the traumatic and difficult life circumstances and work demands that are present in our lives, and how we were able to adapt that in a way to thrive, frankly, is central to this mission of changing the narrative. So we have these 4 goals. One is to change the narrative, as Tammy talked about, of what's possible for girls and women of color by exploring our life stories, and not just for the sake of like capitalizing on our trauma, because you hear that, I don't want to capitalize on our trauma. No, Terry, Tammy, and I have each done fairly well in life. And a part of this give back is to say, hey, there's something about each one of us that is extraordinary. We're extraordinary. We're just ordinary women. And the reality is, I think all women are extraordinary. And so we can each change the narrative of our own lives, and then ultimately change the collective narrative by being really open about what happened, and then inviting others to do the same. This piece around bringing awareness, which is the second aim, is bringing awareness to the intersectionality of global gender inequality and environmental and systemic racism. These issues happen, as I mentioned a little earlier, all around the world. And so the purpose of the social impact campaign is to make a social impact. So we're telling the stories for the purpose of, releasing the documentary, which will be in 2022. Right now, we're also building this social impact campaign, and the intention is to partner with community-based organizations, social justice advocates, women's organizations, and other nonprofits and university programs to utilize the personal narrative stories, and then the creation of the educational component, so that globally we'll be in this conversation of bringing awareness about the intersectionality and the global impact that it has. It's so often Americans are looked at, and traveling, it doesn't matter where you go, it's like, oh, you're American. It doesn't matter that you might be a person of color. There's this perception that America is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and people want to come to America. And I'm not saying that, America certainly has its pros and its cons. And the reality is that the systemic issues, the gender equality issues, the environmental racism issues, the oppression that happens within our economic, educational, healthcare, and other systems is just as prevalent here in the ways that it disproportionately impacts people of color as it is in every country around, arguably around the world. And so bringing awareness to that intersectionality and how powerful we can be when we wake up to our own capacity, again, focusing on women and girls, to change those systems is central. The next piece is, and I highlighted a little bit when I mentioned nature and well-being, which is really to also make the great outdoors more accessible to people of color. We do everything. We're capable. Typically, we dominate in the things that we do when we step into those spaces. And so this idea that I can't do that, or I don't feel comfortable doing that. Well, certainly there's some cases where we aren't necessarily wanted, but those are the spaces that we need to occupy and shift. And so making the outdoors accessible is really central for mental health and physical health and well-being. And it's also essential for our impacting how our world is being treated, because the reality is one of the guides talked about that has been up Kilimanjaro, over the last 30 years. He talked about how the ice fields have decreased quite significantly, and so has the glaciers. Many people don't know that there are glaciers and ice fields at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. Sadly, most people take a picture of the sign, which is fine, but the reality is there's a receding of the ice fields and the glaciers. And by 2030 between 2030 and 2050, they're expected to be gone. And so this connection to nature is about our own individual, but it's from the one to the many. It's about once we use up the resources of this planet, where do we go? And so it's very much tied, and many indigenous people from around the world have a connection to the earth as a living, breathing thing. And certainly as a person of color, when I'm in those spaces, I feel more connected. It's just getting me and others to those spaces so that we collectively can experience individually, more health and well-being, but then also we can transform how we're decimating our natural resources and make transformation happen there. And then this last part about uh, opening the hearts and minds of women to acknowledge their power and resilience, that for me is at the heart of what this documentary is about for multiple reasons. And I'll just say this. Sometimes it takes a while to grow into yourself, to understand who you are, to claim your strengths, because so often we focus on our weaknesses. And far too many girls become women who struggle to really own the fullness of who we are. We focus on, what we're not. And so one of the, not just the central theme for me, it's the primary thing is this acknowledging our power and resilience, because until we do, we're not going to get into the places of leadership in the public and private sector or in the nonprofit area at the levels that we really should be. And we are making, well, arguably we're making advances, but nowhere near the levels that we should be. And so it's really crucial that in acknowledging our power and changing this internal narrative of worthiness and not being enough, and what do they call it? The imposter syndrome dynamic. And if you're a person of color and a woman, then obviously for those of us who have experienced it, then you have to deal with, those who are in power being threatened, and then how you navigate those spaces. And so that's a part of what we're going to be communicating, how we've been able to do that in the spaces that we occupy, so that we aren't dimming really the light, and we can, as we stand fully in who and what we are, we can then welcome others into the sisterhood of doing that, and really women, empowering women, supporting one another to be our greatest, and then our unifying in the spaces that we occupy. And then ultimately around the world, we will be able to change not just the personal narrative, but the collective social narrative and change that needs to happen. And so we want to open it up for questions for those who might have questions or feedback. I will say, as those might come in, that you can get more information about the documentary. If you go to the next slide, it's expected to be released in 2022. There's information available about it at 3extraordinarywomen.com. We are in the midst of fundraising to complete it. Production was substantively complete in Tanzania in September, as I mentioned. So we're in post-production right now. The goal is to release it. The date that we've set is June of 2022. And to begin the process of partnering, which we've started, but to continue that of partnering with other organizations around the world, certainly in the United States, but around the world, to initiate this social impact campaign is at the heart of what we're working on right now. So feel free to communicate with us at info@3extraordinarywomen.com if you feel so inclined to have the social impact campaign, part of it, come to your organization. Terry, Tammy, are there things you'd like to say in your concluding remarks?
No, I think I'm good. I'm certainly open to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Same here. I'm open for questions.
Okay. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions yet from the attendees, which is fine. I think I would just like to offer the importance of every voice being heard, and every person who feels so inclined to step forward in really dealing substantively with whatever you feel like might be in your way, because there's something in each of our ways. One of the things that we talk about is what's still in the way for each one of us. What aspects of ourselves do we have to really work through in order to step forward in the ways that we feel called or compelled. So thank you each for each of you who attended, for being present. And if we don't have any questions, then that concludes, and we will wrap up. Thank you.